Good afternoon all. I'm Dave Smith from Abley based in Christchurch, and welcome to our webinar series. We'll be holding 4 webinars starting with this one today, one each fortnight over the next couple of months. Thank you very much for sharing your lunchtime with us. They're aimed at lunchtime to perhaps give you a little bit of relief from your otherwise busy day. The webinar today will be presented by myself and Benjamin Walch from our Auckland office, who I'll introduce very shortly. So Benjamin is he's a senior transportation engineer. He'll be presenting on the Accessible 15-Minute City. He's just popped up there. And I'll be presenting on modelling a future with reduced vehicle emissions. Our subsequent webinars will be focusing on road safety, technology, and then walking and cycling respectively. So there's something there for everyone. This is somewhat like a normal Teams call, other than the fact that unfortunately you're muted, but you do have the chat functionality if you'd like to ask us any questions. We will be sticking strictly to the 30-minute time frame. However, if you've got questions, please put them in the chat box, and Benjamin and I will look to get to them later on if we have time. So I will crack into my presentation. Great, I trust everyone can see that. So this presentation, I actually prepared it for the MUGS conference, which was held virtually over the last few weeks. So it did come from an exercise where I was trying to use a transport model in different ways to be able to calculate vehicle emissions. And also apply it to the new procedures that have recently been released as part of the Monetised Benefit and Cost Manual. So an overview of the presentation, I'll talk about the changes in the Monetised Benefit and Cost Manual procedures, show an application where I've used a model to test several different spatial planning scenarios from Queenstown Lakes District, and then pull out a few learnings to share with you all. Firstly, the emissions calculations. So there's a new procedure that was released in August as part of the version 1.5 update from Waka Kotahi. This slide just shows the previous calculations, which were essentially calculating the carbon dioxide emissions as a function of vehicle operating costs for links, and then for intersections it was a function of the amount of fuel use on the transport network. There was a fixed price of around about $65 per tonne, which I understand reflects the current trading price fairly well. But there wasn't a specific procedure which took into account changes in the vehicle fleet in terms of different fuel types. So the most recent enhancement is somewhat more complex and reflects the direction of industry far better in my view. It takes into account not just the fleet composition in terms of light and heavy vehicles, but also the different fuel types that are being used with the emergence of hybrid and electric vehicles and the increased uptake across New Zealand. It takes into account speeds and the relationship between speed and carbon emissions. And it also has a low and a high cost. Now those costs are based, there's not a lot of detail online about how they've been calculated, but I understand they reflect shadow prices. So it reflects the cost in relation to emerging national and international targets around carbon emission reductions. One of the key components in the new methodology is to tap into the vehicle emissions prediction model. So this you can apply to basically get access to this. And I'll just quickly talk through a couple of the key features here. In the top left corner, it allows you to put an input year there. So if you're undertaking a future assessment, it has default values that are linked to the likely different fleet composition in the future, as well as the different fuel mixes. And you'll see there's a mix of petrol, diesel, hybrid, electric vehicles. Another key input in the middle is speed. So the way that speed is used is it reflects the average speed across an entire journey, and that has it takes into account congestion, it takes into account acceleration and deceleration. And there are a number of other user inputs. So for this modelling exercise I've undertaken, I've just used the defaults that sit within the model, but clearly there's a lot of detail there, a lot of intricacy if you choose to go down that path. Another interesting change is that the model is used to calculate a carbon dioxide equivalent, which isn't just the carbon emissions themselves, the carbon dioxide emissions, it also is a function of nitrous oxide and methane as well. So it's a more complex calculation that is included within the model. And this shows a couple of key trends. So on the left is the carbon dioxide emissions, and that's presented on a per kilometre basis and as a function of the average trip speed. And as you'll see on the left-hand side, the lower the average trip speed, so therefore there's a lot of congestion, there's a lot of acceleration, a lot of deceleration, the higher the relative carbon cost. And then as the speeds increase across the journey, then the average carbon per kilometre cost comes down. What's interesting there is I've also included a 2018 and a 2048 set of rates, and you'll see that for 2048 it comes down markedly to about half the value of 2018, and that's as a result of the fleet composition, which is a nice segue into the right-hand side, which shows two things. In orange, it shows the default assumed percentage uptake in hybrid and electric vehicles for New Zealand, which currently sits at around about 3 or 4%, with that increasing to over 60% over the next 30 years or so. In blue is what that actually means in terms of the carbon dioxide emissions or equivalent emissions on a per kilometre basis. So you can see that changing vehicle fleet is resulting in a reduction over that 30-year period. And what was particularly interesting in this assessment was that we had previously undertaken some similar calculations using the vehicle fleet emissions model from Ministry of Transport, and some of the previous predictions had by 2050 had upwards of 80% of vehicles being hybrid and electric. So the updated model is not as aspirational, I guess you could say, or optimistic around the level of hybrid and electric vehicle take-up. I'll now demonstrate the modelling application, which we undertook in Queenstown. Just in short, here's the process. We use the Queenstown Lakes District TRAX transport model and derive the speeds from each model for different times of day. Now this was broken down on a trip-by-trip basis, so it looked at where the origin was, the destination was, calculated the average speed, and then used the vehicle emissions prediction model to turn that into carbon equivalent emissions on a per kilometre basis. That got aggregated across all of the trips for each period. Undertook this assessment at 2048, and then derived that an annual figure by putting in some expansion factors from the individual periods to represent annualised vehicle kilometres travelled. And then it was monetised using the procedures in the Monetised Benefit and Cost Manual. On the left-hand side, you'll see that we've got the 2018 emissions in orange, and in grey the 2048 emissions. So there's about a 6% net reduction. Now, I mentioned before about a previous assessment we'd undertaken where 80% of the fleet was hybrid or electric. That resulted in a very significant reduction, around about 30 to 40%. So the less aspirational predictions around hybrid and electric vehicle take-up have resulted in a less significant change. We did a bit of calibration against an Ernst Young report, which had the Otago region greenhouse gas profile emissions, and the model was in 5% of the values there district-wide, which was really encouraging. So there was some calibration there, which gave us some confidence in these results. Interestingly enough, for those that have been around for a while and remember the Project Evaluation Manual, which was before the EEM, there was a simplified procedure there to be able to assume that carbon dioxide costs were 4% of VOC. When I had a look at this analysis, it was actually equivalent if we assumed the low cost of around about 4.1 to 4.4% of VOC. So that was an interesting bit of back validation, if you like. As part of this exercise, we took 3 spatial planning scenarios. Now, this is from an early iteration of some work which I've undertaken with Queenstown Lakes District Council and Waka Kotahi, looking at basically how the district should develop. And as part of that early scenario, we looked at an intensified scenario where we had basically more development in the existing urban areas, expansion where more was pushing out into greenfield areas, as well as an interesting scenario which we called connected settlements, where we looked at 2 towns that were basically growing up from next to nothing. All of the scenarios were really looking at changing where residential development was and where commercial development was in the district, but they maintained the same population and employment totals, and the tourist activity, which is obviously a major thing in Queenstown, remained unchanged. So the intention here was to look at how sensitive is the spatial planning scenario in terms of how it influences carbon emissions. Here's just a quick overview of some of those changes. These were not bookend scenarios, so we didn't throw everything into the urban areas, but they reflected moving in different directions in terms of planning against a future baseline. So the results were very interesting. This graph presents the VKT. It's noted that Queenstown Lakes District is a very high growth area where household numbers are basically looking to double within 30 years. And as a result, the VKT roughly doubles as well. And you'll see that in comparing the first 2 bars in that histogram in front of you. The scenarios result in about an 11% spread of VKT, with less VKT for intensification, more VKT for expansion. And interestingly, the intensification scenario, as well as the base, had a higher proportion of VKT in more congested areas, which attracts a higher carbon cost. In comparing the scenarios, the total carbon dioxide tonnes on an annualised basis has come down from 2018 to 2048. It's roughly that 6% that we referred to in the earlier slide. Intensification comes down and expansion goes up. But as you see, it's not a massive difference. But once again, these were not bookend scenarios that we were looking at. Overall, the difference in the results, the intensification had 4% fewer carbon dioxide equivalent tonnes and corresponding costs. Expansion was 6% higher, so not a massive difference. But by contrast, the shift in the mix of the fuel types that are used within the fleet reduced emissions by around 54%, and that's with hybrids increasing from the current 3% to 8% over that 30-year period, and electric vehicles increasing from less than 1% to around 55%. So a very, very significant shift there, which in this instance made a lot more difference than the scenarios that we were looking at. So how do we manage growth and development? Yeah, that's an entire presentation or even a thesis unto itself. But just a couple of general trends I picked out of this in terms of an expansion model versus intensification model. Clearly, with an expansion model, you've got more VKT, but those VKT are happening at higher speeds than intensification, which attracts, in relative terms, a lower cost. There's a more dispersed effect on the network in terms of where congestion is occurring, as opposed to intensification, where it is more it's more concentrated and often in existing congested areas. Expansion is less likely to attract mode choice in terms of sustainable modes, whereas intensification, it's a lot easier to be able to walk and cycle to destinations and provide for public transport. So this is pretty much transport planning 101. I'm not teaching anyone anything new here. One thing that was particularly interesting, though, I found a Scandinavian paper which surveyed electric vehicle users, and it was interesting that in rural areas, people were twice as likely to have an electric vehicle than in urban areas. I don't know how that would apply to New Zealand because I haven't seen similar data, but what I took away from that is that often, well, in this particular instance, it was people that were travelling 20 to 80 kilometres per day that were most likely to be electric vehicle users, as opposed to those having a small amount of trips, or those that probably required more reliability because they were doing a lot of Ks each day. Linked to all of this is how do we actually support behaviour change? There was an interesting article on Stuff earlier this week, which was titled "How High Does the Carbon Price Have to Reach Before Behaviour Changes?" And I recommend having a look at it. It was a bit frightening, and referred to a UK study which suggested that the price of carbon has to increase by about 15-fold in order to be able to encourage behaviour change. In real terms, that would be equivalent to about a $3 increase per litre in petrol. So it's an interesting article. I encourage you to go away and read. I'm sure there's plenty of other literature there, but it certainly, for me, hammered home that we really need to take people, as an industry, we need to take people on this journey, and it's going to be a tough ask. So what next? Some of the things I took away from this small modelling assessment exercise is that we can't just rely on technology alone, and we need to think about other things. In terms of spatial planning, for example, maybe we should be thinking about a somewhat more of a bookend approach rather than just stretching things in one direction or another. Trying something a little bit more extreme. Regardless of what we do, we need to provide four modal choice, both in terms of destinations for people to be able to get to from new development areas, but also in terms of infrastructure so that they can walk, cycle, use public transport to be able to get where they need to go. Behaviour change programs are fundamental to this, and that article I was referring to, I guess, demonstrates the challenge there. And behaviour change programs, yeah, there's very much the carrot and the stick, but yes, a challenge for the industry there. And ongoing monitoring is something that I certainly encourage, such as local authorities undertaking mode share surveys to look at how we're tracking over time. So thank you. That's my presentation. I'll now hand over to Benjamin.
Yep. So hopefully everyone can see me properly. So I'll talk about this concept. Hopefully some of you are familiar with it. I'll explain where the concept comes from and then how we've applied it to New Zealand. So this relates to two geospatial assessments we've done for Auckland and Wellington. And I'll post a link at the end of the webinar, and you'll get a follow-up email as well for you to go and see the detail of these studies. But I'm just going to whiz through because we're time limited today. Okay, so the concept of a 15-minute city comes from university professor Carlos Moreno, based in Paris, focused on human smart cities. The idea is to define proximity to destinations in the neighborhood using a unit of time of 15 minutes. So it's a mobility concept, but it's more than mobility. It's about making a neighborhood come alive by making those destinations accessible, but also by reducing fossil fuel powered mobility. So it's about walking and cycling, and that's why distances need to be short. So this concept has been taken up by various cities in the world, but originally by current Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo in her 2020 campaign. She used that concept to promote a move to neighborhood living and defined certain key city living functions such as living, so that's the home, working, supplying, so that's supermarkets, caring, learning, enjoying, and finding fulfillment in life, which is a sort of cultural and participation dimension. So this has been applied elsewhere, and they've used different amenities or services to map out 15-minute city or 20 minutes neighborhoods to assess how close people are to essential services. Ottawa, for example, have based that on a survey of residents where they assessed how important each service or amenity is to them and got them to rank them so they could assess which destinations need to actually be close to where people live. Interestingly, in New Zealand, Hamilton City Council applied for the shovel-ready funding back in 2020, last year. They were unsuccessful, but I understand they're still trying to progress the idea. So that's something to keep an eye on. How to measure each of these key city living functions that people need to be in close proximity to. So in our geospatial assessment at Abley, and I want to thank Andy and Maz for the great work on the geospatial assessment, we used open spaces and cafes as a measure of the enjoying function. Now, we could have used many other things, but without these are services that residents use often, and most residents use fairly often. And we use supermarkets as a proxy for the supplying function, excluding dairies though, because they're not quite providing all the grocery needs. Primary schools as a proxy for learning, and GP practices as a proxy for caring. So we use these four types of destinations to measure whether people are within 15 minutes walk of essential services. Now, we didn't include the work function. Work is a bit tricky because you obviously don't necessarily work in your neighborhood. That depends on your skills, your industry. So you may need to get a job that's on the other side of the city just because it's a fairly niche industry. So it doesn't quite work the same way. So I'm going to show you a few screenshots of these maps, but again, you can go have a look at them in your own time. So the coverage of open spaces in Auckland, but also in Wellington, is excellent, and I'll comment on that in a bit. Cafe coverage in Wellington is also pretty good, as you would expect, especially in the central city. The supermarket coverage is quite patchy, and I'll comment on that. The primary school, so this is Porirua and Lower Hutt and Upper Hutt. The primary schools coverage is quite good in the central city, but as you move towards the outskirts, it gets a bit patchier. And the same applies to GP, so this is South Auckland. So I'll comment on those in a second. Finally, we put those layers together to combine the city living functions and to assess whether each of these cities is a 15-minute city, or more exactly, which neighborhoods conform with the notion of a 15-minute city. So this is what it looks like for Auckland. You can see that apart from the CBD, some town centres pop up. So, for example, Onehunga or Devonport come up as 15-minute city areas. And for Wellington, it's a similar story. CBD is very well covered, but then other areas are quite patchy and probably also relate to local villages or local town centres. Across the whole of the Greater Wellington region, we've assessed that 30% of the population is within 15 minutes walk of all combined factors. So that raises questions on how we can increase accessibility for residents of other areas, or how can we bring more residents into the areas that have already got this really good accessibility. Okay, so now I'll just go through a few learnings. So access to open spaces is excellent in both cities. We're quite lucky in New Zealand to have great outdoors, but also great access to open spaces in our cities. And at a time when we're in lockdown in Auckland and we're in Mental Health Week, it's easy to recognize that these open spaces are a true public health asset. Supermarkets, as I mentioned, the coverage is quite patchy. And when we analyzed those results, we compare that to European cities that have mini supermarkets or neighborhood supermarkets, like you can find in Paris and London, for example. Here we have dairies, but over there, those supermarkets are actually equipped to cater for daily needs, for all needs. So this is quite different from New Zealand, where we still have this model of large supermarkets that people can drive to, do their weekly shopping and drive home. If we want to promote short walking trips to supermarkets, we also need to bring those supermarkets closer to where people actually live. In terms of the primary schools, the coverage is fairly patchy when we get out of the city. But there's one point here, and that's probably something that can be investigated further. We used walking speeds for adults, so fairly fast walking speeds, and it'd be interesting to see what it would look like for children and whether we can increase that primary schools coverage, which could also contribute to reducing the school rush and congestion related to the school rush. Finally, access to GPs is quite limited in the outskirts, especially in South Auckland, so that raises equity questions, equitable access to healthcare and local care services. So this sort of assessment can really show which areas can be prioritized for various types of services. So in terms of what that means for the transport and planning professions, we need to plan for proximity and density. So this sort of 15-minute city assessments can show where developments should go and where density should go. It shows the importance of mixed-use developments as well, because mixed-use developments are a tool to bring these essential destinations or city living functions into residential neighborhoods. There needs to be a consideration for the quality of the pedestrian and cycling experience, because you could have those essential services within 15 minutes walk theoretically, but if the walking experience is not right, you're not actually going to do it. And that comes back to integrated transport planning. So thank you everyone for attending. We have a few minutes for questions, but I'm more than happy for you to follow up with me, and I'll post the links to the articles in the chat. Also, just a note that the University of Waikato is doing a survey. I'll share the link as well. They're trying to assess, like Ottawa did, for example, what destinations are important for people to have in their neighborhood. So if you could contribute to that, I think that's really important work.
Great. Hey, thank you very much, Benjamin. We have got a couple of questions on the chat, and we've got a few minutes to address them, which is fantastic. There's a couple which are comments there. Hamid is mentioned, just noting that Christchurch City Council's Transport Activity Management Plan also refers to 15-minute city concept and includes a level of service for that target. A comprehensive geospatial analysis has been done to inform the case with maps available on request, and it will probably be public soon enough. That's fantastic, Hamid. And you've also followed up that your spatial model considers employment opportunities too, and recognises the CBD and key activity centres as commercial, industrial zones, and port and airport as industrial, and universities as educational employment opportunities. Great, thank you for sharing. A couple of other questions that have just come in. Excuse me one moment, I'll just scroll around here.
I've also just posted the link to those articles and the survey in the chat, but we'll send that in the email as well.
That's very fast work. Well done. Lawrence says, interesting, is the location of jobs reflected somewhere, or is it only from a residential perspective?
So yeah, currently we've excluded jobs, and so that's potentially where the assessment could be refined, but the question is how we approach that, because you may have lots of jobs available in your local area, but that might not be the right job for you. So, and especially if you compare that to Europe, for example, there's a much higher rate of renting. So people are more mobile and they can move closer to their jobs. Whereas in New Zealand, where it's more ownership based, there's less spatial mobility potentially. So it's all considerations, and that's why we've left it out for now. But it's an important factor.
Great. Hey, thanks, Benjamin. And got time for one more question. Todd says, it would be fascinating to understand the relationship between an area meeting the criteria and house prices. Any insights into this?
Definitely, that could be our next blog article.
Great. Hey, thanks for the idea, Todd. Look, we will sign off. Thank you very much for sharing your lunchtime with us. The next webinar in this webinar series from Abley will be on the 12th of October, and that will be presented by Dr. Shane Turner. It'll have a safe systems theme. Hopefully you've received invites for those, but look, if you would like to know any more about what we do or wanted to just discuss what Benjamin and I have presented, please feel free to get in touch with us. And look, we once again thank you very much for spending some time looking at these topics with us. Right, we'll sign out, and all the best. Thank you.